right. Welcome, everybody, to this week's Rising Tide Foundation lecture, where I am extremely happy that Colonel Towner Watkins has agreed to join and share some of her insights and research, especially as far as it pertains to the very disgusting thing that's been latched onto, like a parasite latched onto its host over the past 80 years, really since World War II ended, of Nazism, unreconstructed Nazis that created a fascist international that operated directly with the CIA, NATO, MI6, and the entire intelligence apparatus that has caused so much damage to humankind over the last, several generations. So Cynthia and I have been remarkably impressed by everything that Colonel Towner Watkins has pulled together. She's got a fantastic channel as well, which will be linked in the description box for those who haven't already found out and followed and subscribed to the Colonel's works. Again, just very much impressed by your rigor, what you're looking at, your insights and sense of valuing what is more and less important is great. It's very rare. So again, today we're going to look at something that I think is extremely strategic value, considering that there's increased discussion and likelihood of more declassified documents that may see the light of day sooner than we may realize, that pertain to what was behind the murder of JFK, RFK, MLK, and other things. We'll see. I mean, there's obviously there was a lot of time to doctor material, shred things. So we'll see what happens. But all that to say, the potential right now for some major reverberating shakeups of big narratives is high. So, Colonel, thank you, and I'm looking forward to everything you have to say. And afterwards, when you're done your formal remarks, we'll open up for Q&A.
So I love the description of rigor. I call it an obsession with the truth. Just because for the people, I don't know all of the people that are here, so I don't know how many of them know about my background. So I'll just briefly let you know that I spent 30 years inside of the beast in the U.S. military and the Air Force, and considered myself fairly well educated. I took advantage of the educational benefits, which was the only reason I joined. I accrued 6 degrees in various subjects. I went anywhere from aircraft maintenance, which is what I did when I enlisted in order to get the GI Bill, and all the way up through Air War College and an MBA. And so that required a lot of reading, and I love reading nonfiction. And so I obsess over that type of information. And so to find, thanks to your wife, Cynthia, and Anthony Sutton, that I'd been lied to for 30 years was kind of devastating to me. I stumbled across actually Anthony Sutton's books, and went on to read several of Joseph Farrell's books about the Third Way, Fascist International, and all of that. And I stumbled across the term stay behind units, which was a new thing for me. And given the fact that I spent a year in a master's degree called Strategic Studies by Air War College, I thought I'd become fairly familiar with most operations since, back in Genghis Khan. I mean, we went back to forever. And I'd never heard that term. And I'm like, that's crazy, because it seemed in the context of the book to be something fairly big that happened during World War II. And I've studied that extensively. And so all I did was just a regular search on Yandex. And I'm like, what the heck? And then I came across Operation Gladio, obviously, because that's kind of what it morphed into. And it was exposed by NATO. And just for the people here, I was in NATO the day.
Hold on, Lynn.
What?
No, all's good. That was somebody who is now on mute.
Okay. I landed in Rome Airport for a 3-year assignment the day Andreotti announced to Italy that Operation Gladio was a thing, the 2nd of August, 1990. And so when I read that, it became very personal for me. So how do you live in a foreign country in the middle of such massive exposure and not know anything about it? And so now when I talk to people and they go, oh, that can't be true because my parents are from Nicaragua or Cuba or wherever, and they don't know anything about that. I'm like, join the club. That's what this is all about. And so I have a personal ability, which is very unique because of my personal experiences, to be able to empathize with people in this discovery of what it feels like to be in the middle of this, watching all of it unfold and never even know it has a name. Never. I watched on the nightly news in Italy, prosecutors being gunned down in front of courthouses. In Sicily, they killed 5 judges in one day. And this was all part of the disclosure. I just thought it was a very violent, mafia-ridden place, but it wasn't. It was all about the disclosure of Operation Gladio in this extensive stay-behind network that had been orchestrated, as you point out, since World War II. And so the more I dug into it, obviously, the more pissed off I got. But like probably the 4th book that I read was Cynthia's book. And I was so compelled because she took from World War II and basically went backwards. And that for me added the context as to why this all happened, and starting, and obviously it goes back even further, but starting at the Fabian Society point is a very good point to bring it forward, to put it in context of what we're living today, and the fact that these people are 100% fascist. They are 100% for a totalitarian, not communist, because communist means all of the oligarchs go away, and they absolutely do not want that. So there's going to be this fusion of a strongman dictator, as they did throughout all of Latin America for Operation Condor. And the one thing that set JFK apart from all of his predecessors, especially Truman and Eisenhower, was he was against all of it. And so the more I got to learn about Operation Gladio, the more I understood, okay, well, if they did that in Guatemala, which was kind of the first real big coup under Operation Gladio type principles, although the Latin America one became referred to as Operation Condor because they basically overthrew everything except for what was owned by the UK, ironically enough, throughout all of Latin America, and installed dictators. And so I was like, well, shit, did these people murder JFK? Because that was one of my first thoughts. So the more you dig around, the more you uncover all about the Warren Commission and how obviously we know that was a complete setup, but little pieces that no one ever talks about. One of the most devastating was I read a book about the oil pipelines, because you quickly realize the CIA has never worked for the United States government, ever. None of the intelligence agencies around the world work for their governments. They work collectively for the oligarchs. And that becomes very apparent when you look at the resource piece of why they're overthrowing all of these governments. And so that made me start to look at the kind of the nexus between what is the intelligence agencies all about. And of course, you go back and you look at the BND and them installing Reinhard Gehlen, the Nazi, in charge of the West German intelligence agency in the immediate aftermath of World War II. So then you realize quickly that this has nothing to do with them actually trying to denazify anything, because I can find an example of how everything they told us in our history classes in school was a lie. And so then you have to start rethinking and rewiring your brain as to what actually. So when I read the book about oil pipelines, I found out that Allen Dulles and John Foster Dulles, obviously we know they worked for Sullivan and Cromwell, which represented Rockefeller, JP Morgan, and all of the interest in resources around the world, to include the Panama Canal. And how we stole Panama even before World War II from Colombia. And so again, you start putting all of these pieces together and you're like, holy crap. It's a worldwide effort to control all of the resources. So once you put that piece in play, you quickly realize Allen Dulles was working for Standard Oil, goes on a trip to Baku, Azerbaijan. He is representing Standard Oil buying an interest in a Swedish-owned company. They owned a pipeline there, a Swedish company did. Their representative there was D. Morgan Shield's dad, the guy we find in Dallas, George. So George's dad meets with Allen Dulles, and they arrange Rockefeller to buy part of, well, their entire share of the Azerbaijan oil field. So you realize, having done all of this research, that Allen Dulles knew George from the time he was 11 years old. And he just so happens to show up in the JFK as the guy who befriends Lee Harvey Oswald. Yeah, that's not a coincidence. And he becomes the star witness in the Warren Commission for Allen Dulles. That's not a coincidence either. So now I basically, in my brain, question everything about JFK. So then I start going back through JFK papers, and I want to know everybody that he talked to. I want to know every foreign country that he was working with. You find out that he befriended Charles de Gaulle in the freedom of Algeria, which was definitely not kosher at the time. He befriended Nasser in Egypt, who was trying to collectively work for pan-Arab interest and making a deal with Syria to throw off the jackals of the CIA trying to get all of their territory on behalf of the UK and Israel. And the alliance, which just blew my mind, since the last half of my career was fighting what I thought was radical Islamic terrorism, only to find out that Saudi's in the middle of all of it. You know, I've dealt with lots of Saudis, and to find out that Saudi, Israel, and the CIA, all of their intelligence and their role in the BCCI money laundering bank and the trafficking of weapons and the trafficking of drugs, they're all collectively together and against anyone who stands up to them, which happened to be Nasser, which happened to be Assad. And so that basically made, excuse me, Indonesia. When you look at Sukarno, no one knew at the time. That's whole Greg Polgrain. Have you read his book? Do you know who he is? Okay, so Greg Poltrain is a professor down in Australia. He wrote a book. He actually went and lived in Indonesia, and I talked to him, and he lived in the house next door to Obama's father-in-law. Now, they weren't there, obviously, by the time Greg Polgrain gets there, but he was actually, for the time he was doing his research, living in the house and in the neighborhood of Obama's and his mom and the stepdad. Yes. So he has all of the inside dirt on everything. And Obama's stepdad was a colonel in the army that overthrew Sukarno and installed Suharto. And so he covers all of this in his book. And Sukarno and JFK, I think it's like 60 letters they wrote back and forth to each other. JFK had invited him over. What JFK didn't know at the time is Standard Oil had arranged a deal where they went in partnership with an oil find in Indonesia that had not been public at the time. It was discovered like in 1932 by the Rockefellers. This all came out much later. And the UK, Dutch Shell, and Standard Oil, they kind of butted in, but they got an interest in it. It was the purest oil ever found in the world and the largest gold mine ever found. So at the time, back in the 30s, they hired a whole bunch of geologists to go all over the world and find resources, and then basically tried to work to overthrow governments to basically get those resources. So the largest gold mine ever found, the most purest gold ever found in Indonesia. So they want it, but they don't want to give Indonesia their fair share. So they have to overthrow Sukarno and install Suharto, which they do after they kill JFK. So you can't look, I know there's a lot of people that go, oh, it was Mossad and it was all about the nuclear weapon. And that's the end of the story. You know, they kind of fold their papers up and put them aside. You cannot look at JFK and not look at every single thing that he did. So now you've got the Gladio forces in France that hate JFK because He wants Algeria. He's in cahoots with de Gaulle, which they all hate. They try to kill him over 20 times. So you've got them pissed off at you. You've got the people that want the gold and the oil in Indonesia pissed off at you. You've got basically the entire CIA, right? Because they blame them for the Bay of Pigs, even though that was the CIA's fault. They screwed that entire thing up, but they blamed it on JFK. And so there's just a whole bunch. And of course, you have Israel that didn't want the nuclear inspection. So there's just a whole lot of forces arraying. But the one pivot point in all of them is the CIA. The CIA was orchestrating all of this along with NATO, MI6, and you begin to realize that JFK, no matter what he did, because what he did was right, and in the best interest of the foreign countries in which he was trying to help get on their feet. The Congo, look what they did to Lumumba. It was almost a month before JFK found out that he was assassinated, 3 days before he got in office by Eisenhower. He didn't even know. They didn't tell him. They boiled that man in acid. And no one bothered to tell JFK. He didn't find out until like the first several days of February that his CIA had murdered that man. And basically destroyed one of the foremost leaders that could have changed African history forever. And it just kind of went downhill from there. There's a lot more, but I think that's probably a lot just to kind of open the field for people to realize that there was an entire world that had aligned against JFK. And I think you transition that till today. That is the position that Donald Trump is in today.
No, thank you for that very, very concise, brief, but very concise reminder of that extremely important point in history. And I got to say, too, I get a little bit frustrated because I also encounter what you observed, that a lot of people, they try to find this like very simplistic, simple answer that deprives them or that helps them avoid having to think too much about the dynamic behind why JFK was murdered. And so they latch on to like, oh, it's because he was trying to shut down the Fed, or it's because he was resisting AIPAC, and or they'll come up with this one thing, and it's like, no, that's so mechanistic and unsatisfying. It's like it's everything. He had a full spectrum mode of thinking of the cultural fight, anti-imperialism, taking down the support structure of the CIA, and so all of that was so important. So really, I thank you, and I think that does create a nice foundation for some dialogue and discussion with the audience.
It sells JFK short. The guy was actually very, very pivotal in the history of our country.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, it reduces it to something that's just kind of banal, almost like an anomaly of a guy who tried to do something out of step and either made mistakes or whatever, picked a fight that was a little bit too big for him. But they don't realize that he was representing something so universal that made the American Revolution possible. Yes. That makes America viable and good. And they missed it.
Yes. And they killed him for that.
Yep. So I noticed that Neil got in early with a digital hand, and I ask everybody to follow Neil's lead, either in popping a digital hand up to ask the Colonel a question, or pop your name like usual into the chat box, and I'll call upon you accordingly. If you want me to ask the question for you, just make your question short and easy to read, and I'll read it if you want me to do that. But until then, Neil, it's all yours. But you're on mute, and everybody's on mute by default.
Okay, I'm Neil Graham from Henderson, Nevada. I've never spoken on this format. I'll make my question very short. James Files, who died in the mid-90s, he spoke at great length about the weapon he used to assassinate Kennedy, and how he was organized with the mob to do so. Do you have any comments about this?
I will tell you that I'm familiar with his confession, if you will. I know that so there were multiple people in most of these assassinations, worldwide that I've studied, and there's been over 90 overthrows of governments and over 400 attempts by the CIA worldwide. So there are some patterns. At no time was the assassination, if they are going to shoot a head of state or someone significant, was it left to one team? Never. There are a collection of which is practiced so that there is no screw up. So there were multiple shooters that day. One person did not do that. There are proven OAS, which is the name of the Gladio forces from France that were present in Dallas, Texas, that were over in that grassy knoll area. They were French. And there are witnesses saying that there were French men in that area. Most of them are now dead. But there are also a Dallas police officer that gave a statement saying that he was directed by the police chief to drive a French man to the Mexican border. There is also, and I think his last name was Ferrari, a CIA asset that flew at least one, depending on which account. Some said there was a total of 4, but collectively I've verified 2 names, that one of which was flown out by a CIA agent that night. Now, they all are dead. The ones that either, if you go with the 3 flying out, the other 2 have since been died under mysterious conditions. I'll just say that. But they were assassins, and that wouldn't be unusual. So I don't know. No one's verified that they were there. There's just reports that they were. The one definitely did die, and it does look like he was poisoned. So there were, we also have, obviously, the Cuban exile. We didn't even talk about the Cuban exiles. The Cuban exiles were, they show up in every single Gladio style event that was conducted by the United States CIA in Nicaragua, in Guatemala, in Angola. They were basically trained assassins. And I don't know if you watched the Tucker Carlson interview where he talked to Felix Rodriguez. Felix Rodriguez was one of those assassins. I just about fell over dead when I saw Tucker. I don't think he even knew who he was. He was a member of the Brigade 2506 that is notorious for trading the death squads down in El Salvador. And he freely admits he did it. He was in Vietnam as part of the Phoenix program doing assassinations. He was one of the guys flying around in helicopters, killing people and throwing them out the doors of the helicopter. And Tucker Carlson interviewed him. Those people were also present in Dallas. So I take James Files' account with a grain of salt. Could he have possibly been one of the trigger pullers? Yes. The mafia was definitely in bed with the CIA, conducting a lot, but the mafia actually ran the drug networking distribution that paid for all of their covert operations. So it is not uncommon to find mafia type people involved in these operations with the CIA because they were in bed with them for the drug distributions.
Yeah, that's good. I got a quick question on, have you looked at all into the Knights of Malta?
Yes.
Yeah, you have?
Yes, because for the Italy's, and again, Italy's is personal for me. So when you go back and you actually look at the Gladio cell that was in Italy, and just for the audience, Gladio is a term that has been generically applied to all of NATO assassins across the world, these Gladio operations, the stay behind network. That doesn't mean that they were all referred to actually as Gladio, because in Portugal, it was called the Ginger Press. In Turkey, it was called Grey Wolves and a couple of others. And that was for the decentralization so that if one was found out, you still had operational capability, continue do your covert operations. In Italy, it was almost extensively referred to as Gladio. And then because they were the first ones to announce it to the world, all of those operations kind of fall under that term now. So that I will use that generically through the conversation. The Gladio, actual Gladio in Italy, everybody that was involved in it somehow got knighted, to include the Grand Mason of the propaganda duo called P2 Lodge, Gelli, Gelli, who was an atheist. Now, the Knights of Malta is a Catholic order that you have to be Catholic to be in. But they made exceptions for anyone operating in Operation Gladio that had one of their like big roles. And the Knights of Malta seem to have served as a cover for meetings and coordination, specifically as it related to Italy. Although you find many of the CIA directors during this period of time all got inducted into the Knights of Malta as well. And what's really interesting about that is obviously Paul Williams, the guy that wrote the book Operation Gladio, I've interviewed him twice, and he tells you that the idea of a sovereign is what they look for. So the Vatican Bank being chose as the money laundering initially right out of the gate post World War II for the drug operation they set up out of Taiwan, ends up being the pivotal point, because it's not, the bank is sovereign within a sovereign piece of ground called the Vatican. So you have a sovereign within a sovereign. So you have a double insulated area in which you can money launder and no one can do anything to you. So everybody that was involved in that system became a Knights of Malta. Colby, James Angleton, all of these guys get inducted into this. So then they all show up at the regular meetings. I did not know this, and I've been to Rome many times. The Knights of Malta has their own sovereign piece of ground in Rome with their own army. So that was a news, like a head blowing thing for me. I didn't know that. And so they too had their own like mini Gladio cell that they could deploy to take people out if they got too close to the truth as well.
Yeah, like that's people don't realize that it's called the Sovereign Order of the Knights of Malta because
yes,
they're like a sovereign country and they have their own passports, and anywhere they have an embassy, you can get your own passport issued for.
And why is that important for this?
Is that international assassination operations?
Why is that important for sending assassins around the world?
Get into countries without having to prove that you're
no record,
an assassin. Yeah.
No record, because they're not going to tell you who they gave passports to.
Yeah. Yeah.
And Agentes Press in Portugal did the same thing for them. Agentes Press was actually a press. It was a printing press. They manufactured passports. They manufactured all kinds of alternative alias documentation, birth certificates, everything for this entire network ran out of NATO.
Amazing, eh? All right, so we got Richard and then Sam. Richard, go for it.
Yeah, I don't know if anybody will know the answer here, but it doesn't seem to me that Trump is in the same position as JFK was. He seems to have some kind of effective protection. If they were going to take him out, they would have done it. And the so-called assassination attempts were certainly not of the kind you described, where multiple teams, you know. So, I don't know. Does anybody have any comment on that? I mean, he seems to have
there's obviously
protection from above to carry out his program.
So there's obviously some lessons learned. And I believe his close relationship with JFK Jr. There's so much to what you just said, actually. If you go back, I don't know how well versed you guys are, but I'm reading another book right now called Politics, and it's about all of the same stuff. And one of the CIA cutouts was a thing called it used to be called Mary Carter Paints, and then it became Resorts International when they moved it out of Tampa. It was a mafia front, and they moved it down to the Caribbean, and they set it up as a casino, which basically it was a money laundering operation with Paul Helliwell, who set up Castle Bank as a money laundering operation. The guy that ends up with Resort International is Trump, and he does so through Roy Cohn. And Roy Cohn was intimately involved in everything I just told you about. He was a mafia attorney. So there does seem to have been, a long time ago, a coalescing of people, whether they realized America was in danger or Trump had something on them. I don't know. I can't even explain it. But the coalescing of all of these people that had huge ties into this entire octopus all seem to hover around Trump. And Trump seems to have, as a result, inside information into how they all operate. And he seems to have always been able to be one step ahead of them. So your point is very well taken. He is in the position of JFK taking on the world, but in a much more protected way.
Thank you.
Stam.
I found your comments about George de Mohrenschildt very interesting because we know that he introduced Ruth Paine to Lee Harvey Oswald. And we know like Ruth Paine got Oswald the job at the Texas School Book Depository. She was the, I believe, the biggest witness at the Warren Commission. So yeah, I found that really interesting. If you have anything else to share about de Mohrenschildt. And what I wanted to ask is if you can speak at all about PERMINDEX, seeing as how you have ties to Italy, and the role of Clay Shaw, like how close was Jim Garrison, and any info you have about Louis Mortimer Bloomfield, seeing as how he's from Montreal, and we kind of have a bit more association with him, I would say, and he seems like a significant figure, although he's sort of shrouded in mystery as well.
So what's interesting to me is how close Canada plays in a lot of this. It seems to have been a haven for, I'm going to use the word offshoring. It's probably not the right word, but in my mind, it kind of serves that purpose. So the connection between the Pritzker family and the Brofman family, it seems like there were mirror images of everything set up on each side of the border. So that if you lost one node in their operation, you were not dead in the water because there was one protected on the other side of the border. Whether it was the cocaine network, so they did a two-prong approach. They took it in through Canada and brought it in through the northern border, while at the same time, originally it was Cuba, but then of course it became the southern border. They were bringing it in from the south. And so they were never going to be without supply. And Canada provided a pivotal role in all of that. And there is a counterpart in Canada in this story for just about every person that I talk about from the U.S. Now, obviously, I didn't dig into as much of them as I did the U.S. because obviously, having been in the U.S. military, I'm much more concerned about our role in that. But I did notice that, and that's an excellent point to bring into the whole conversation. I just don't know as much about them research-wise. But I will tell you something that was really funny. Another coincidence, the judge that was in the trial that was originally from Cuba, that's up in New York, I can't remember his name off the top of my head. His family in Colombia has drug ties. And his nephew is running a huge marijuana distribution in Canada, just over the border, bringing it into, and I have all of that on my notes. I just don't remember all of their, but we found that in just, like a couple of days of digging into that. What was his name? Do you remember, Matt? The judge that was in New York, that was part of the Trump's trial up there. But whatever, the one who had the daughter that was getting all the millions of dollars from everybody. Yeah, he's dirty as all get out. Marchand, there you go. Yes, that's the one. Okay, so PERMINDEX is a very interesting company because what I found out is there was like one in New Orleans, one in Chicago, one in Europe. There were these there's another name for them. They're like the World Trade Center mini. And PERMINDEX was one of them. They, under the guise, and that's why the big business piece of this is so important that everybody leaves out, the oligarchs. They would use these world trade venues to come together and orchestrate like trade associations and stuff like that so they could collectively screw us. They fix prices using these apparatuses. And the one in New Orleans, of course, is where you find Clay Shaw and all of those guys, because they ran all of the Latin America, Banana Republic. That's where the ships left to go down to the Rockefeller ship lines, to hit the rail lines down in Guatemala, Nicaragua, and all of those, the Banana Republic. It's where all of the ships left to go to Cuba. All of the drugs, I mean, not all of them, obviously some came through Miami, but a lot of the drugs came into the United States through that trade mart in New Orleans. And so the trade mart that was there, the trade mart that was in Chicago, took all of the Canadian ones coming across the border up there. And that's where they were doing the distributions out of these quote unquote trade marts. PERMINDEX basically served that same purpose. So I found it very interesting that there was this entire network of the business piece of this, which is why, again, to the point that Matt and I were just talking about, it's intellectually lazy to basically blame the JFK assassination strictly on a Mossad connection. It is also intellectually lazy to say that the CIA was behind all of this when they actually worked for what I refer to, the name I've given it is an international syndicate. Because a lot of people, they like to say, oh, it was all the bankers, or it was all this, or it was all that. It's not, it's all of them. The Rockefellers, the JP Morgans, the Rothschilds, they make up an international syndicate. There's a whole bunch of them in Japan. There's an even bigger clan in Korea. There's a whole bunch of people in some other countries that you wouldn't normally think to even look at, like India. The Sassoons and the opium people that basically inundated China with opium. Their heirs are still around. They're still part of this international collective that tries to oppress us and enslave us with all of this terror used to control us.
Well, you mentioned Resorts International,
yes,
which was tied to Meyer Lansky,
yes,
who was instrumental in the early days of Israel as well. So. Yes. There's no doubt what you're saying about the syndicate nature of this network.
Yes.
It extends around the world, and yeah, you're right. It's not just one country.
Correct.
And if you look at just the creation of Israel being a British project, I mean, from the Balfour Declaration, JFK famously said Palestine was hardly England's to give away. Like England.
Yes.
The creation of Israel was a British geopolitical move so that the British would have an excuse to be involved in the Middle East, which was an area of growing importance in the 1890s due to the discovery of oil and all the trade routes that were moving into there. And the Russians had the Orthodox to protect down there, and the French had the Catholics to protect down there, and the Turks had the Muslims to protect. The British didn't have anybody to protect. So they said, well, we'll protect Jews, right? And it was all part of a geopolitical game that the British were playing. So, like you said, Canada, you find Canada is tied to this. Canada is inextricably linked with England.
Correct.
And the Council on Foreign Relations, which you mentioned, Dulles, he was the second director of.
Yes.
Yeah, it's a worldwide syndicate of these oligarchs.
So let me take that one step further and introduce the term strategy of tension, because strategy of tension goes hand in hand with stay behind units. The stay behind units were designed by nature to create a strategy of tension internal to a country that they wanted to overthrow, right? So after World War II, all of the maps were redrawn, right? So new countries popped out of whole cloth. One of those new countries was Israel. Another of those new countries was Pakistan. Another of those new countries was Taiwan. Now, go back and look at where every single one of the new countries out of whole cloth, the division of Korea, the division of Vietnam, all designed to create a strategy of tension. So no matter where in the world I want to implement this strategy of terrorism to effect control out of chaos, I have my seed already planted for the chaos. All I have to do is water it. And that was done by design. Kurdistan existed prior to World War II. It was dissolved and embedded into Turkey, Syria, Iran, and Iraq on purpose. They did that because none of those countries liked Kurds. They hated them, as a matter of fact. And they persecuted them. And every time you want to go to war over there, all you have to do is do a false flag involving a few dead Kurdish people, but flip it. So it looks like the Kurdish people attacked Turkey, when in fact it was the Turkish Grey Wolves dressed up as Kurdish people to do the false flag. And then all of a sudden you got a war. And that was done by design. The same thing happened in Israel. Israel was placed there in order to destabilize the Middle East so that they could do whatever the hell they wanted there. And you trace back, I know Matt and Ghost has done that on their show. You trace back the Muslim Brotherhood, British. You trace back Hamas, funded by all of the above. You Hezbollah, the Mujahideen in Afghanistan, Al Qaeda, ISIS. It was all created by the terrorist, or excuse me, by the intelligence agencies to create this terrorism. And when did that start happening? It started happening right after 91, when we lost our boogeyman that had been the communist. So go back to all of the Latin American overthrows. They all occurred because of that communist boogeyman that happened to have been installed in Cuba, and we can't have another Cuba. So we overthrew all of the democracies in Latin America because we didn't want another communist. And we installed fascist dictators because we didn't want a communist. Well, I don't know. Castro didn't mass murder all of his people like Pinochet or any of the other dictators that the CIA installed down there to destabilize them. And every single one of them, if you trace back why, go to Chile. You will find ITT, which is the predecessor of AT&T. You will find Freeport Mines in their former capacity, and you will find PepsiCo. They paid Richard Nixon to kill Allende because Allende was nationalizing the mines because his people was treated like slaves, and ITT was spying because they owned the infrastructure for the telephone and telegraph capability in Chile, and they were spying on the country. And so he nationalized that. He was kicking PepsiCo out because they had a monopoly there, and they just paid Nixon to kill him. Oh, but they had to call him a communist first.
That's what kills me listening to you right now is I just know so many Americans and Canadians who, because of this unresolved brainwashing over 70 years of Cold War propaganda, that justified and that was run by this whole fascist international masquerading as the anti-communist league of the world.
World Anti-Communist League.
Yeah, like that's really the fascist international. It took over, and people didn't resolve that, and so they'll hear what you just said, and they will shut down. So many people I know will just shut down when they hear and just put in the trash a lot of what you said because Allende is a commie. everything was justified because it was to stop communism. And that type of simplistic equation just makes so many people dumb.
Do you know what I go back and tell them? All right, so if Valente is a communist, you tell me what communist actions he took. He supported labor unions. He never closed the press down. It was the press that did him in. It was the press that was, that press guy was in bed with the CIA, who funded through USAID, by the way, the artificial news that came out of Chile. So if you believe the USAID is bad and all of the shit that they've been doing is bad, then if they were funding the press and creating the press, do you believe the press now? No. Well, then when did they start lying to you? Did they start lying to you when Trump got elected, or did they? Oh, they lied about JFK too. Okay, well, if they lied in 1963, do you not think they were lying in 1972 when they killed Allende? So again, if I look at the fact that the AFL-CIO was being funded, they literally were taking CIA money. They set up an international office in Washington, DC. They funded infiltrators in every union initiative. So I asked people, like you just illustrated, do you support unions? Well, yeah, they did some really good things. Okay, well, why couldn't Chile have unions? Why was it okay to take mining down there, that copper mines? We have tons of copper here. Why wasn't the companies Freeport mining copper here? Well, because of unions. And they would have to have paid the workers too much and they wouldn't have made as much money. So they go down to Chile and they get the concession for the union mine down there. And they were paying those guys 87 cents a day to work in mines. So they wanted to unionize. And were they allowed? No. So the CIA called Allende a communist because he supported the unionization. So is unionization good or bad? You can't have it both ways. If it's good here, then it's good there. And it's the same way with the banana workers in Nicaragua. The Sandinistas wanted to allow them to have their property back that had gotten stolen from United Fruit. And for that, oh, well, wait a minute. Aren't you the same person that said you don't want China owning farmland in America? Do you think that's bad? Yeah, that's absolutely bad. You don't want them owning land next to military bases? That's bad. So when the Sandinistas said they didn't want United Fruit owning their farmland, that makes them a communist. So are you a communist too because you don't want China owning our farmland? You can't have it both ways.
Yeah. No, these are lovely, lovely ironies. That's good. These are little resources. That's nice. All right. Monty, I see your hand's been up there for a while.
Yeah, thank you very much, Colonel. Longtime follower. And this has always been close to my heart, this whole Operation Gladio thing. I mean, I go back to Vietnam, but I understand it even goes back to Korea. So I kind of witnessed that firsthand. But my comment and my question is in regards to stay behind armies, okay, which the Gladio was. I mean, Nazi stay behinds, which got kind of the covert side of NATO. But interestingly enough, I tend to look at what Trump does as opposed to what he says.
Correct.
And what he has done in the last couple of weeks, if you look at it, just like the FBI took down the mob by going after the money. Look what Trump did. I mean, in the United States, part of the stay behind armies I see is this entrenched bureaucracy, which is they're trying to make unaccountable to the president. In other words, they're trying to make the case that the chief executive officer of the United States cannot have oversight, fire or hire or audit these agencies. I mean, USAID, National Democracy, National Endowment for Democracy, the Treasury, and so forth. Well, Trump bought on a so-called oligarch called Musk. Mm-hmm. And within a couple of weeks, with his little DOGE 19 to 25-year-olds, he went in there and they found literally billions of dollars in USAID and the Treasury, which was used to finance color revolutions, overthrowing of governments, the whole media apparatus, the New York Times, political, all Ukrainian state-sponsored. So this really seems to be a tentacle that they've used.
Yes.
And I applaud Trump for what he actually has done in going after this and creating a fight over this, which I think honest people just can't just can't reject out of hand. So your comment on that, please.
I agree with you 100%. And it was really interesting that I actually read someone had posted on X a comment from one of the like Norm Eisen or one of the entrenched weirdos, where he actually used the term stay behinds, which I was like, what? Because he was talking about the bureaucracy that they have embedded to sabotage Trump. And that is by very definition the I mean, obviously the stay behinds we talk about have weapons caches and stuff like that, and they, blow up shit. But this is the bureaucratic version of Operation Gladio. You're absolutely right.
Stephen Doyle.
Hi, Colonel. Thanks very much. Really enjoyed your talk. Ex-Canadian Air Force guy here, 31 years. Yeah, I'm hear everything you said. You also mentioned Farrell, whom I read when I started getting into the real world. And one of the things he's flagged for me on the JFK thing is apparently JFK was looking at space cooperation with Khrushchev on the slide too. So now we're talking NATO, Gladio, paperclip type stuff. Von Braun, the book on Mars, the Martian leader Elon. The coincidences are just killing me. Do you have any thoughts on that?
Well, yeah, and we didn't even talk about the so one of the patterns that I've recognized is anyone who opened a dialogue, to include the Pope, by the way. Part of Operation Gladio, John Paul, I'm not Catholic, the one that got shot. He was actually shot by a Turkish Grey Wolf assassin. And they've proven that. That's who went to jail for his attempted assassination. And it was a Gladio operation. But if you go back and you look at the actual attempted assassination, as they referred to it, it was clear he was not killing him. It was a warning. And what most people don't know is that he had been, because he was originally from Poland, he had been in negotiations with Poland to bridge the gap with the Solidarity people and peacefully exit the Soviet Union. And just for having that conversation. So the Vatican charged a 10 to 15% surcharge on every dollar they money laundered. So he had hundreds of billions of dollars eventually through this whole money trafficking, money laundering operation they were doing for the intelligence operations and selling drugs. So he was using part of the Vatican money to send to the Solidarity Unit to basically buy their release from the Soviet Union. And as a result of that, he was in secret dialogue with the Soviet Union to peacefully allow, and that was not unprecedented. A couple of other countries had basically done the same thing, but they were, kind of behind the scenes compensated for doing that. And he was shot because of that. You were not allowed to talk to the Soviet Union. You cannot have anyone negotiating with this big boogeyman if they're going to continue to use the boogeyman and actually realize that they are willing to negotiate with you. That was not allowed. So anyone, and to include JFK, when they found out, because he was he was behind the scenes using loops as a go-between between Cuba and the Soviet Union, JFK was, to peacefully reopen Cuba, which of course couldn't happen either because the mafia still wanted it for their drug interdiction into America. And so that's when I left out. Thank you for reminding me of that. As soon as it was discovered, and Lutz was not his friend, by the way. As soon as it was discovered that that was happening, that just put another bullet in him.
Yeah. And just an aside, some people have argued that John Paul I was murdered because
100%.
Because he was looking to audit the Vatican Bank.
Have you I don't know if it's Paul Williams' book or Danielle Ganser's book, NATO Secret Army. One of the two actually goes step by step over that murder scene The nun that went in that morning and found him said that there were banking documents all over. He had already scheduled an announcement to basically reveal that the Vatican bank had been money laundering for this operation. And the papers were all over. It was obvious because the poison they used makes your body, and this is how we know Jonestown was a lie. The poison was the same poison that supposedly Jonestown, and what it does to your body is it makes your back bow up like this. So the only thing that is touching is your head and the heel of your feet. And that's the way they found him. So he had been poisoned. He had been murdered. And I think it was like the 32nd or 33rd day, one of those Masonic kind of P2 kind of signals that he was murdered as a result of announcing that he was going to reveal the Vatican role in this entire operation. And then that nun supposedly was sent off the next day to a convent on the eastern part of Italy, and she never showed up. So she just disappeared out of thin air.
Thanks.
Sure.
On that note, do we have any hypothesis about anything that John Paul II might have been up to when he got shot? And
that's what I was just talking about. He was dealing with Poland.
The second.
Yeah.
Okay,
he's
right.
the guy that was dealing with Poland. He was shot by a Turkish Grey Wolf guy.
Right.
That guy had both of the two guys that showed up in Rome as part of the team that was going to shoot him were Turkish trained Grey Wolves out of the Gladio operation in Turkey. And he was negotiating with Poland to use some of the Vatican cut of the money laundered to pay basically to get Poland out of the Soviet Union.
Gotcha. Right. Yeah, sorry, I was
You're
texting
not allowed to talk to the Soviet Union.
Right.
But that goes hand in hand with North Korea too, because I want people to understand there's patterns to everything. What did Obama tell Trump his last day there? Don't talk to the North Koreans, because as soon as you talk to them, you realize everything that people have been telling you about them is lies.
Yeah, you can never humanize the enemy. That's
no. Yes.
Walter Segrist had a very interesting comment and some references, which would be interesting to get your thoughts on. Walter, are you still there to read this aloud yourself?
Yeah, hello. I'm just from Basel, Switzerland, and the PERMINDEX was localized in Basel.
Yeah.
So I found some interesting documents. I'm not at all an expert in this field, so I just plucked that out of my archive. Maybe some interesting reference for you. Awesome. Shall I read it or?
Yes.
Yeah. Well, yeah. Read it.
Mm-hmm. De Gaulle named Credit Suisse of Geneva as financier of Bloomfield's attempted putsch and traced its origin to NATO headquarters in Brussels. PERMINDEX was forced to move out of Europe to fascist-friendly South Africa. Simultaneously, de Gaulle kicked the Israeli Mossad out of France due to its cozy relations with PERMINDEX. Credit Suisse Canada has been identified by some researchers as COE, paymaster for the PERMINDEX assassination of JFK, which was accomplished after Stephenson set up an operations command center in David Sarnoff's RCA building at New York's Rockefeller Center. And this is from a WordPress reference I give in the chat. But as I said, I'm far from being an expert here. I'm just collecting some stuff.
Those are really good leads, and I'm taking note of your considerations in that link. I don't know if Colonel, you'd have any thought, or you just want to.
If you wouldn't mind, I'm on my phone as the camera. If you wouldn't mind just sending that to me, because basically what he's describing, I don't know if any of your audience has read the book Final Judgment. the guy, they basically tried to ban that book. It is about JFK's assassination. And it is one of the several books that I've read. It talks a lot about what he was just referring to in the move to South Africa and the fact that Israel, and what's very interesting about all of that is you find that throughout the next 20 years, to include the 1980s when Reagan was in office, that is the same setup. The Israeli functions as an arms trafficker for the United States, right? So anything Congress says that they can't do, the State Department and CIA just gave the money to Israel for them to do it for them. And so a lot of what Israel did was through South Africa. So that's how they got arms to Angola. They used, and it's obviously that's how they, South Africa tested all of Israel's nuclear weapons for them. We discovered during the test, because we noticed it on our, we have a system that monitors nuclear explosions, and we found them occurring off the coast of South Africa, which is how we confirmed Israel, because then we traced back all of the, France gave them like the, a lot of the technology, and it was a BCCI cutout in Texas that gave the switching mechanisms not only to Israel, but also to Pakistan. We basically facilitated Pakistan getting a nuclear weapon. The CIA did. So Israel, the South Africa, Israel was such a prolific arms dealer, providing them to Iran. You know, the whole Iran-Contra, that was Israel. Israel was the cutout that we used to get the missiles to Iran. Israel obviously had a heads up that we were going to be overthrowing a lot of countries in Latin America, because they not only facilitated arms to some of those countries, the bad guys, they set up actual manufacturing. Now, if you're an arms dealer, you don't build manufacturing for a temporary dust up, right? If we're just going to go in and overthrow a government, you're not going to build a rifle, ammunition plant, and rifle manufacturing. They did all over Latin America. Galil, you can look it up. That company is everywhere in Latin America, which is really weird. Unless they knew there was going to be a long-term overthrowing of multiple countries to cut off this, you know, you don't need to ship them if you have the manufacturing right there. And the same thing I found out when I did the World Anti-Communist League research project. I have a series of shows with Alpha Warrior on that particular entity, and was dumbfounded at Taiwan's involvement in all of this. Taiwan actually set up a intermediate graduate program for death squads. It was called the Taiwanese Political Warfare Cadre under the World Anti-Communist League. So there seems to have been a 3-part training for everybody in Latin America. If you're a ground pounder, you know, junior death squad guy, you went to the School of Americas, which was in Panama. And that taught you how to torture, assassinate, and kidnap dissidents. If you were selected for a middle term leadership school, they sent you to Taiwan. The number of Latin American people that went to this political academy, and Chiang Kai-shek was brilliant. He had figured out, and this was his big claim to fame in this whole operation, that if you turn death squads into, it just renamed them a political party, like he did his KMT army. He just called it a political party. And then all of a sudden it was a democracy. So and I'm not even lying, that is exactly what he did. So in all of the Latin American countries, Panama, Guatemala, Nicaragua, that we overthrew, Chile, they took the death squad people and called them a political party. And this was learned at the Taiwanese political warfare cadre, that school. This is what they taught them to do. Just call yourself a political party. And then in the US media, if anyone attacks you, the death squad, they're attacking democracy. And that's exactly what the Democrat Party has done. They use that same mantra. If you attack the evil, USAID or whatever, you're attacking democracy. This is the lesson they learned from Chiang Kai-shek, the drug dealer.
Brilliant. Brilliant. Yeah, there's so many questions that popped in my mind, but I'm going to hold back because I know Karen and Pascal have two questions. Karen asked me to read it. So Karen asks, what do you mean by saying that everything we learned about North Korea is a lie? Thank you.
Well, the Reader's Digest version, and obviously there's a lot to do too. I would suggest I'm at Colonel is spelled out Towner on X. If you go to my pinned post, there's a box link. I did an entire series on Korea. The way after a war that you rehabilitate or settle a country after World War II is they designated, and we did it in the Philippines and all over, we designate areas for the ability to rehabilitate, right? So we did it in Europe with a Marshall Plan. We said, you're going to be the governor of this country or the whatever. So in Korea, they divided it up into two. The Soviet Union, because they were our ally before they were our enemy, got the northern sector. The southern sector of Korea was given to the United States. Same thing happened in Vietnam. Chiang Kai-shek, although they called it China, it was not China, it was Chiang Kai-shek, got the northern sector of Vietnam, and the UK got the southern sector. Now, of course, the UK just let the French back in and basically tried to recolonize it. But in Korea, the US quickly realized the only person that had viable ability to be a leader there, who had lived through the 35 years of colonization by Japan, was Kim Sr. Okay, he was located in the north under the jurisdiction at the time of the Soviet Union. So all the Soviet Union's mission was agreed upon was they were going to push out the remaining Japanese. That's all the US Army was supposed to do in the South. Nothing else. As soon as you push out the last Japanese soldier, you have to have an election. They all signed up for that. The US Army decided that's not what was going to happen. They were not going to allow an election. And so what they did is they started killing all of the nationalists in the South so that they could reintroduce a person that had left the country a long time ago that was hanging out in Chiang Kai-shek's area of Shanghai in China. Okay, so they're going to insert this guy and pretend he's the leader. But in order to do that, all the nationalists that hated him because he left them to die at the hands of the Japanese are rebelling in the South. Well, the US Army went in and killed all of them. They annihilated entire towns of resistance to an imposed leader that they were going to prop up and then basically pit him against Kim. Well, they realized because Kim in the North during the war actually had his own OSS detachment helping him fight the Japanese because they were all on our side, right? Same thing with Ho Chi Minh in Vietnam. They were on our side. He had his own OSS detachment helping him fight the Japanese. We turned our backs on both of those people. So we actually inserted stay-behind units in the northern area under the control of the Soviet Union to make the Soviet Union look bad in the north, like they couldn't control the violence. Well, one of the guys that was in prison in the north was a guy by the name of Reverend Moon. And depending on which account of the Unification Church, depending on which account you read, he was in there for pedophilia. So during the MacArthur push, because of the violence instigated by MacArthur's stay-behind units in the northern sector, we justified an incursion into the north for that reason. And who's one of the first people we released? Reverend Moon. Okay. So we spring Reverend Moon. He runs to the south. We continue north. We go all the way up to the Chinese border. Now, I'm going to speculate this one part right here because there's a lot of corroborating evidence. There's just not a smoking gun. The United States CIA wanted to reinsert Chiang Kai-shek into China. And they tried repeatedly to do that. I believe the run all the way up to the north was to do exactly that because we didn't even stop at the Chinese border. We went over the border. We were actually violating their airspace. That is when we provoked the Chinese to enter the war, and they pushed us back to the current DMZ. And it was then that Kim was isolated because the CIA realized he wasn't going to be a patsy. And it's been that way ever since.
Wow. So your hypothesis is that the Korean War itself may not have happened had they been more successful at just entering China, installing Chiang Kai-shek, and not allow. And then if that had happened, then the Chinese wouldn't have entered the Koreas, and the Korean War wouldn't have happened. Is that sort of one of the
Korean War
consequences?
would not have happened had the U.S. not embedded stay-behind units and provoked the false flag of violence in the North, which MacArthur used as an excuse to invade the North. Because during that same time, all they were supposed to do is to get the Japanese out, have an election, and go home. The U.S. was instrumental in forbidding that election from ever happening. And they did the exact same thing in Vietnam, almost to a T. Well, actually, it was actually much worse. They used psychological operations in the Catholic Church and involuntarily moved over 1 million Northern Vietnamese down to the South so they could pretend that there was a large Catholic population in the South to support the installation of Diem in the South. And then you basically replay the same thing because Ho Chi Minh, who flew to Paris with his own Declaration of Independence and Constitution to mirror the United States, wanting the United States to help him keep the French out, and the U.S. told him to pound sand. Go home and play in your jungle, and we're going to reinsert and support the French in there because they wanted the opium out of Laos, Cambodia, blah, blah, blah. And so we basically sabotaged what could have been a very peaceful transition of Vietnamese. Ho Chi Minh was never a communist, neither was Kim. They were nationalists that wanted their country basically to themselves without the Japanese occupiers or the U.S. occupiers, or in Vietnam's case, the French. And on top of that, I'm saying that once they decided that they were not going to be able to use Kim, that's when they decided that they were going to push all the way north. At what point they decided they were going to use that as an avenue to try to reinsert Chiang Kai-shek in there. I'm not saying that was their intended purpose initially, but it is obvious when you look at Tibet and the training of terrorists there to aggravate the hell out of China. When you look at the Uyghurs and they're training terrorists there and inserting them there to aggravate the hell out of China, the creation of Formosa into Taiwan to aggravate the hell. And I didn't know, I'm sure your wife probably knows, I had no idea there was 8 other islands that fall within the Taiwanese jurisdiction, and they launched attacks into China from every single freaking one of them. Did you know that?
No, I did not know that.
One of them is a mile south of the Chinese. The Taiwanese actually owns 8 islands. The U.S. gave them those islands to aggravate the hell out of China. And Chiang Kai-shek launched attacks from every single island. So they surrounded China just like they surrounded Russia.
On the issue of Reverend Moon, it is useful to. I remember reading this paper called "Reverend Moon's Gnostic Sex Cult" by Larry Hecht. And have you encountered that paper?
Yes.
Yeah, that's a crazy one.
He's a freaking weirdo.
Yeah, no, he describes this period when he was under CIA retooling mentally as his loving period of brainwashing. So he spoke of it fondly and publicly as his brainwashing, but in a really great way. Kind of like those people who get like sexually molested by alien abductions, and they're like, oh yeah, but they loved me so much, like there's these weird stock. But then he also goes on to become the instrument for the World Anti-Communist League as well, right?
And the World War II Japanese war criminals. Yeah. So they all collectively do the Asian one. The Asian People's Anti-Communist League turns into the World Anti-Communist League with Reverend Moon, the 2 guys from Japan that literally were war criminals. And Chiang Kai-shek was instrumental in that. So Reverend Moon, I don't know if you know this part either, the Moonies are trained assassins as well. So they get deployed all over the world to do Gladio operations. And they just so happened, once they lost Cuba, bought like a, I don't know, it was like 300,000 acre farm to grow opium in Paraguay. And did you know who owns the farm right next to them? The Bushes. Not even lying.
Wild, eh? And they own the Empire State Building too.
Yes, and the Washington Times.
Right? Yeah. Yeah. Hey. Okay. So many rabbit holes. All right. So Richard had a follow-up question. Do you still have that same follow-up question, Richard?
Yeah. No, it's just a follow-up comment on Trump and what he's already done, and also the question of stay-behinds. So, I mean, you guys probably know this, but I mean, he's doing major purges, in all the departments, which I think hits at the stay-behind problem. That's all. I just wanted to complete the circuit on what Trump's been doing.
Yeah, hopefully. I don't know if he'll be able to get down far enough. Let me just give you an anecdotal. Obviously, I was stationed all over the world. I did 6 years in the DC area. The first 2 years was over at Andrews Air Force Base. I never encountered anything in my life like the workforce in Washington, DC. Obviously, I had probably half civilians and half military working for me. I was a squadron commander there. And my first day on the job, half of the civilians did not show up for work on time. And so I'm old school. I was former enlisted maintenance troop and kind of hard brass tacks kind of person. So the next day, I had a clipboard. I didn't know who any of these people were. I didn't, recognize their face or anything because I hadn't even met most of them. But I was dumbfounded at the fact that they just felt like they could scroll in at whatever time of the day. Our duty time was 7:30 to 4:30. So I had a clipboard. And as they walked in, I wrote their name down and what time they came in. So the following Friday, when I got their time cards, I called each and every one of them in my office. And I said, you have one choice. You either change that time card or I'm calling the cops and I'm going to have you arrested. You just falsified government documents. Your duty time is 7:30. You get your ass in on time, or your time will be docked and you will be held accountable discipline-wise, and your ass will be fired. Now, I was told by my higher command that had been a perpetual problem. And I'm like, you assholes, why didn't you ever fix it? Why are you leaving that to me? And the one guy, I'll never forget this, in field operations, our headquarters was Warner Robins, Georgia. And this old Southern guy said, you better watch your car tires because somebody's likely to slash them. And I said, if they do, they'll be dead. But that's the work mentality in DC. It is like nothing you've ever seen in your life. But they started showing up to work on time. I did end up having to fire one of them, but it is unlike anything that, and I'm talking, these are like what would be considered like GS7s and GS9s. These are not like the GS15 kernel equivalents that you have embedded in the Pentagon. It goes that far down. So I don't know, with the exception of moving that shit out of Washington, D.C., which I am in full support of, I don't think you'll ever get rid of the stay behinds there. That's my opinion. I've lived in that. I was at the Pentagon for 4 years. It is so buried deep. The political appointees demand general officers lie in congressional testimony. It is so pervasive there that if you don't move that operation out of D.C., you will never fix it. That's my personal opinion.
Pascal asked me to read out his question, so I'm going to read it. So here it is. JFK was looking at great infrastructure projects in the USA and worldwide to improve mankind's status from an anti-Malthusian optic. Trump, it seems at first sight, is looking at a real estate solution for a peace in Southwest Asia, Gaza. Will Trump be able to organize the U.S. population to do what Lincoln, McKinley, JFK intended, but on false premises? Thank you. Oh, I see what you're saying. Yeah, because there's no like JFK had a very clear vision of an industrial renaissance to break empire. That was very clear in his approach. Trump, that's not at all part of the approach at all, vocally, or seems like a real estate orientation is the discourse. So yeah, okay, so yeah, I get that question.
So I think he's using his forte, which is real estate, to kind of walk in the back door. I'm not convinced that his goals are not very similar, but he is doing it under the guise of what people recognize him. Because, you know, people think Trump's stupid. They totally underestimate his ability to understand situations. So I think he's framing all of his solutions in the terms of real estate, which everybody acknowledges he's an expert in. So I'm not convinced he's not doing that. He's just framing it in a different way.
Cool. And Pascal had a second follow-up question. Reads, what about taking all of the young folks TikToking and put them in a program run by the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers and form a civilian conservation corps type of program? No. Okay.
I don't want the government having any access to young minds at all. That's what got us in the problem.
What about the Peace Corps? That's my question. What about the JFK's Peace Corps idea?
See, I think JFK was admirable in his intention. You can't. Is it in the Constitution? The answer is no. Then you cannot do it. Period. The government has no business molding young minds. Period.
Okay. All right. Good to have that on record. All right. So was that?
Because then the bastards that work for Obama is going to get a hold of them. And you will not always have Trump. You can't make exceptions based on personalities. You have to have standards.
Okay. Cool. Stephen had a follow-up question. Then I don't see any other questions after that. So I'll give people a small window of opportunity to get your hat under the closing door here before we close up. So Stephen has the question, and then if anybody has like a last question that they want to get out of their heads into this digital space, do so now. Stephen, go for it.
Okay, thanks, Matt. Colonel, I'd like to get your thoughts on Trump and DOGE and all the stuff that's been going on in the last couple of weeks, creating carnage in the American branch of the deep state. And by way of context, I'm one of the crazies who subscribes to the thesis that Facebook is actually DARPA's Project LifeLog, and the whole Mark Zuckerberg and the kids at Harvard and the bathrobes. That's just a psyop. The whole movie thing, I think, was just cementing a story. Highland Group, all that sort of stuff. If I apply that type of thinking with Trump and DOGE, I see something similar. I don't buy it that there's a handful of 20-year-old cyber geniuses wreaking havoc on the entity that took out JFK, that started all those regime changes, Ukraine, you name it. So to me, what I see, what it feels like is more like John Warden and taking out the Iraqi army, that level of campaign planning and joint prioritized targeting lists and all that sort of stuff. It seems to me like the whole structure has already been mapped out. And this DOGE thing and forgive the language, the big balls guy and all these jokes coming out now, to me, that sounds like a potentially a positive psyop to make this thing palatable and believable to the masses. But I think there's a whole monster element of planning and intelligence and sequencing and targeting that have gone in the background. You came out at a higher pay grade than I did. What's your take on it?
So I happen to agree with everything that you just said. I believe that the entire first term of Trump was designed so that we have this surface, he didn't know what he was doing kind of persona, while there were people everywhere gathering everything and no resistance in doing it because Trump didn't know what he was doing. Now, you might remember on his way out, they buy all of these government.gov domains, and there was a whole lot of stuff going on that no one had any explanation for. And I believe that there was this massive sucking sound of getting information that they needed in order to be able to analyze exactly how to hit the ground running when they got in the second time. And I believe, and we will figure out whether this is true or not, one of the war games that you play is you send in the meanest asshole in the world to do the initial damage control. And then you send in the nice guy to run the organization, right? So I believe that you have this front of people that is being used, of which Elon Musk is one of them, that will be able at the right time to step out and leave the running of the operation, but that you need the people that's going to tear everybody up. And I believe that's what Rubio is there for. Rubio was deep state. He was 100. I mean, he's my senator, but I believe they had enough information on him to coerce him into being the one, just like the Department of Education chick, the one from Tennessee. She's the biggest DEI clown in the entire world. And Trump gave her the distinction of destroying the Department of Education. I actually love the idea. Rubio is going to be used to destroy the very thing he protected forever, USAID. He was part and parcel of it, and so was John McCain, and so was Lindsey Graham. I actually love the idea of using them as the figureheads to destroy what they protected for all of this time.
And I guess as a tangent to this, rolling back the clock a bit, are you thinking that Trump was Rudy's man on the inside, feeding him information for the takedown of the mob in the 90s?
Well, he actually became an FBI informant in New Jersey. So he was in that role. He admits that.
Okay. Thank you.
Sure.
Vic, yeah, we just have time probably just for one more question. So Vic would like to ask a question or share a thought. Vic, are you there?
Yeah, I'm here. Very quickly, though, on the Resorts International, let me read one sentence. On October 30th, 1978, the Spotlight newspaper reported the principal investors of Resorts International were Myers Lansky, Tibor Rosenbaum, which was a Cleveland mob, William Mellon Hitchcock, David Rockefeller, and one Baron de Rothschild. There's a video of when Trump got into financial trouble, Rothschilds bailed him out saying he was a great salesman. So your point that if you just focus on any one person, you're missing the main thing. But that's not what I want to talk about. In 1980, I met a relative of John Connally's, and this is the story that Connally told about the assassination, and that is that Kennedy didn't want to come to Dallas, but he was kind of forced to. And then he found out the night before that he was the guy riding in the car was going to be something like the Democratic county head, and he went nuts on LBJ and said, no, I'm not going to ride with some schlub. So Connally got in there, and Connally told the story that when the shooting started, he knew that there was going to be a hit on Kennedy. He just don't know when it was. And again, from this relative, they told me he screamed something like, they're going to kill us all, which is kind of an odd thing to say. Well, at the time, there wasn't real wide information on it. I found years later that that's actually what Connally said. But Connally also said, he would never talk about it because if he did, they'd probably take him out and his family. How does the role of John Connally fit in all your work on the JFK stuff?
John Connally is a very interesting, and I mean, I won't have enough time to get into it completely, but he was part and parcel of the LBJ Texas Mafia. That's probably the easiest way to in a short Reader's Digest version, he was a controlled person that owed a lot of where he was to that entire infrastructure there. You mentioned the night before that the night before there was this big get together, and do you know who was running the big get together? PepsiCo. And interestingly enough, I already explained to you how PepsiCo was involved in the takedown of Allende. PepsiCo also just so happens to be the place where the Secret Service chick that allowed the attempted assassination on Trump during Trump's administration, she hid out in PepsiCo in charge of their global security. Nothing's a coincidence. So I did want to mention, you mentioned Hitchcock as the Resorts International. I forget who was talking. In the book I'm reading right now, that guy's whole name is William Mellon Hitchcock. He is an heir to the Carnegie Mellon family that at one point was the second richest family in the United States. And he was the financier for a huge chunk of the CIA's LSD program. Just FYI.
Wow.
Thank you.
It's a small club at the end of the day.
It's a small club.
Yeah. One of the lessons I hold in mind as I listen to you and other researchers who've penetrated down into these weeds is that there seems to be this simple organizing formula that goes back directly as a continuity, because a lot of these things get intimidating for, I think, a lot of people coming into this for the first time, since there's so many different outfits, names, rebrandings. And again, I felt it for years trying to like make sense, but the thing that's lacking sometimes is that sense that there is a simple dynamic. And I find one of the useful jump on points, like you pointed out, the Fabian Society, imperial socialism is one good foundation point to build an understanding of what this thing called fascism and its incarnations were, as well as its interconnections with the mafia, all this other stuff. But really the Crusades, like these satanic orders of the Knights of Malta and the Knights Templar, are sort of, they were created at the same time by the same grand strategist to carry out the exact same thing, to basically transform what appears to be Christian organizations on the surface, but under an ultimately satanic inner core, in order to create a clash of civilizations forever under this sort of permanent feudal dark age system of a high priesthood. And that these organizations never disappeared, and they've just gone through, again, rebrandings. They're still operating with the exact same mandate that was put forth 1,000 years ago. And I think when you have that in mind, you could piece together and fit in a lot of the different,
so
the different details. Yeah.
Yeah, I refer to it as a skeleton. And all we're doing, once you have the skeleton, which is Fascism International, you can start putting the pieces of the body parts on. The heart is this, the liver is this, and you are yeah. So I build a picture every time I read a book. And I'm just like the whole Gladio thing is a wagon wheel to me. The spokes are weapons trafficking, human trafficking, and drug trafficking, and the axle is greased by blackmail. That is Operation Gladio in a nutshell. And I am like that, Matt. I do kind of bring things down. My husband's even better. And let me just leave you guys with this. My husband, who obviously has to live with me and all of this research that I do, and he doesn't do any of it. He's an electrical contractor. He builds houses. He's a general contractor. And I love him to death, and he tolerates all of my research efforts. So he came to me one day, and he is even more simple as it comes to putting things in a nutshell. He goes, "You remember that comedy that we used to watch called Get Smart?" And I said, "Yeah, but I'm kind of busy right now doing this. So what about it?" And he goes, "Do you remember what it was called?" And I looked at him and I said, "No, I don't. What's your point?" And he goes, "It was called Chaos and Control." And I'm like, "Oh, son of a bitch." Oh my gosh. And he goes, "Yeah." He says, "Chaos were the bad guys and control were the good guys." He says, "Everything that you're doing is describing chaos for the purpose of control." And we have been brainwashed to believe that the control, like after 9/11, is always done by the good guys. Chaos is always done by the bad guys. And that is literally, and I looked at him and I went, oh my God. And the message is we are supposed to get smart. And that is Operation Gladio. Chaos and control, daring us to uncover it and get smart.
Lovely. It's a very poetic ending and a beautifully creative presentation. Really, really loved this whole thing. This was great. I'm really happy that you chose to come down and share your time and your amazing work. And if anybody wants to follow your work, if they're not doing it already, again, I'll put the links in the description box. Colonel's Corner is a fantastic podcast, great guests, great presentations. Your work with Warhamster is also very good. So check all that stuff out. Check the links. And Colonel, I look forward to future chats going forward. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you.